12 men walked up that mountain trail in the summer of 1879. None of them ever walked back down. Every single one had visited the same isolated farm where the Keter family lived in their rotting wooden shack, and every single one had disappeared without leaving so much as a footprint in the dirt. What the people of Bramblewood, West Virginia didn't know was that the family they'd been tormenting for sport had been collecting their tormentors like trophies, and the root cellar beneath their farmhouse held secrets that would make a grown man weep. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more shocking stories tomorrow. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Deputy Sheriff Coleman Price spread out the missing persons reports across his desk and noticed the pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. Jacob Morrison, the town blacksmith, had vanished on July 15th after telling his wife he was going up to have some fun with the freaks. Thomas Carlyle, who owned the general store, disappeared on July 28th, last seen heading toward the mountain path with a bottle of whiskey and a cruel grin. Mayor Franklin Webb himself had gone missing on August 3rd, and his carriage was found abandoned at the base of the trail that led to the Keter property. The list kept growing. Samuel Tucker, the banker; Peter Hammond, the butcher; William Cross, who ran the lumber mill. All prominent men in Bramblewood, all known for their weekend entertainment of hiking up to the Keter farm to mock and abuse the Inbred family that lived there like animals in their mountain hollow. All gone without a trace, as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. But it wasn't the earth that had taken them. It was something far worse, something that had been watching and waiting and planning with a patience that bordered on inhuman. The Keter family had endured 32 years of humiliation, beatings, and cruelty from the people of Bramblewood, and now they were evening the score in ways that would have made their tormentors beg for the simple mercy of a quick death. Price had always dismissed the Ketters as harmless degenerates, products of generations of inbreeding that had left them barely functional and certainly incapable of complex thought. The family consisted of old Ezekiel, now in his 70s and missing most of his teeth, his wife Sarah, who communicated mostly in grunts and wild gestures, and their adult children whose physical deformities had made them the target of the town's cruelest citizens for decades. They seemed like broken people, damaged beyond repair by their isolated existence and genetic disasters. How wrong he had been. How catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. As Price would soon discover, the appearances that had fooled an entire town for 3 decades were nothing more than an elaborate mask hiding minds that had turned their suffering into something cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. The Keter family had learned to survive by seeming weak, and now they were using that same deception to hunt the hunters who had made their lives a living hell. The mountain trail that led to their farm had become a one-way path to horror, and 12 men had already learned too late that sometimes the prey becomes the predator. The horror that consumed Bramblewood in 1879 had its roots planted 32 years earlier, when Ezekiel Keter first dragged his pregnant wife, Sarah, up into the Appalachian Mountains and built their ramshackle cabin in a hollow so remote that even the Cherokee had avoided it. He claimed he was seeking solitude for religious contemplation, but the truth was far simpler and more damning. Ezekiel was fleeing the consequences of his sins, and he was taking his sister wife with him into exile. The first generation of Keter children born in that mountain prison showed only minor signs of the genetic catastrophe that was already unfolding in their bloodline. Little deformities that could be hidden beneath clothing, mild intellectual delays that might be mistaken for simple country ignorance. But when those children grew up and began producing offspring with each other, because there was literally no one else in their isolated world, the family's genetic decay accelerated into something that defied human comprehension. By 1860, the second generation of Keter children were being born with twisted spines that bent their bodies into impossible angles, with extra fingers that grew like gnarled branches from their hands, with faces so malformed that even their own mother would turn away in disgust when she tried to nurse them. Some were born blind, others deaf, and many with mental capacities so severely damaged that they seemed more animal than human. The family's attempts to hide their shame only made things worse, because isolation breeds its own kind of madness even without the genetic component. They lived like ghosts in their mountain hollow, surviving on what they could hunt and grow, speaking in a dialect that evolved in complete separation from the outside world until it became almost incomprehensible to normal people. When traders or travelers occasionally stumbled across their property, the Ketters would hide in their root cellar until the strangers left, emerging only when they were certain they were alone again. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in small mountain communities where gossip travels faster than wildfire. By the late 1860s, stories about the monster family living up in the hollow had become local legend, passed down in whispered conversations and drunken tales that grew more exaggerated with each telling. Some claimed the Ketters had made a deal with the devil. Others insisted they were the cursed descendants of witches who had fled Salem decades earlier. The truth was somehow both more mundane and more horrifying than any supernatural explanation. The Ketters were simply human beings who had been systematically destroying themselves through generations of incest, creating a family tree that looked more like a telephone pole, with the same few names appearing over and over again in an endless cycle of genetic self-destruction. When curiosity finally overcame fear, and the first group of townspeople made the trek up to the Ketter farm in 1875, they found a family so physically and mentally damaged that they seemed like living proof that some people were simply born to be victims. Ezekiel, now ancient and toothless, could barely speak coherent sentences. Sarah had deteriorated into a creature that communicated mostly through primitive gestures and animal-like sounds. Their adult children, Jeremiah and Ruth, bore deformities so severe that they looked like something from a medical textbook illustration of genetic disasters. What the visitors didn't realize was that 30 years of isolation and abuse had taught the Ketter family lessons that normal people never have to learn. They had discovered how to turn weakness into camouflage, how to use their apparent helplessness as a weapon, and how to survive by letting their enemies underestimate them so completely that they never saw the trap closing around them until it was far too late. The townspeople left that first visit feeling a mixture of disgust and superiority, convinced they had encountered human wreckage that posed no threat to anyone. They had no idea they had just met their future executioners. What started as morbid curiosity in 1875 had evolved into something far more sinister by 1879, as the prominent citizens of Bramblewood transformed their weekend visits to the Ketter farm into a twisted form of entertainment that revealed the darkest aspects of human nature. Mayor Franklin Webb had been the first to organize what he called educational expeditions to observe the family. But education was never the real purpose of these trips. The real purpose was cruelty, packaged and sold as scientific inquiry to make the participants feel better about their sadistic impulses. Webb would gather groups of 8 to 10 men every few weeks, usually on Saturday afternoons when their businesses were closed and their wives were occupied with church socials or quilting circles. They would pack bottles of whiskey and jars of moonshine, load their wagons with supplies for an afternoon of what they called specimen observation, and make the 2-hour trek up the winding mountain trail to the Ketter property like they were going to visit a traveling circus. The family had learned to expect these visits and would retreat into their cabin when they heard the wagons approaching. But the townspeople had developed ways of drawing them out that grew increasingly cruel with each expedition. Thomas Carlyle, who owned the general store, would bring rotten food and throw it at the cabin walls while shouting that he was feeding the animals. Samuel Tucker, the banker, had discovered that loud noises would send the family into fits of terror, so he would fire his pistol into the air and laugh as they scrambled for cover like frightened rabbits. But it was Peter Hammond, the butcher, who introduced the element of physical violence that would eventually seal all their fates. Hammond had brought a cattle prod on one of his visits and used it to force Jeremiah Ketter out of the cabin so the group could get a better look at his deformed spine and twisted limbs. When Jeremiah tried to crawl back to safety, Hammond would shock him again, creating a grotesque game that had the other men roaring with laughter and placing bets on how long the freak could endure the torture. The women of the family were subjected to even worse humiliations that the men of Bramblewood justified by claiming the Ketters weren't really human enough to feel shame or pain the way normal people did. They would force Ruth Ketter to remove her clothing so they could examine and photograph her physical deformities, treating her like a medical specimen rather than a human being with feelings and dignity. When she would cry or try to cover herself, they would mock her tears and claim she was just making animal noises because she was too stupid to understand what was happening to her. William Cross, who ran the lumber mill, had brought his teenage son along on several expeditions to toughen him up and teach him about the consequences of bad breeding. The boy had initially been horrified by what he witnessed, but his father's encouragement and peer pressure from the other men gradually corrupted him until he was participating in the torture with enthusiasm that matched his elders. The visits became more frequent and more violent as the years progressed, with the townspeople growing bolder in their abuse as they convinced themselves that the Ketters were too damaged to remember or retaliate. They would steal the family's meager possessions, destroy their crops, and kill their livestock for sport, leaving them to face the harsh mountain winters with even fewer resources for survival. What none of these educated, successful men understood was that every act of cruelty was being carefully cataloged and remembered by minds that might have been damaged but were far from broken. The Ketter family had developed their own system of record-keeping, their own way of marking which tormentors had committed which specific acts of violence, and their own ideas about what constituted appropriate punishment for each crime. By the spring of 1879, the family had endured 4 years of systematic torture that had pushed them far beyond the breaking point where normal human beings would have either fled or died. But the Ketters weren't normal human beings, and they weren't planning to flee or die. They were planning something else entirely, something that would ensure their tormentors would never hurt anyone ever again. Jacob Morrison made his final mistake on July 15, 1879, when he decided that tormenting the Ketter family wasn't satisfying enough anymore, and that he needed to escalate his cruelty to achieve the same rush of power he had been chasing for 4 years. The blacksmith had always been the most physically aggressive of the Ketter family's tormentors, using his massive frame and powerful hands to inflict pain that the other men were too squeamish to deliver themselves. But on that sweltering summer afternoon, he crossed a line that even his fellow sadists had never dared approach. Morrison had arrived at the farm with his usual group of drinking companions, including Peter Hammond and William Cross. But unlike their previous visits, he had come prepared with more than just his cattle prod and his fists. Hidden in his wagon was a set of branding irons that he used in his blacksmith shop, tools designed to permanently mark livestock with their owner's identification, and Morrison had decided that the Ketter family needed to be branded like the animals he believed them to be. The other men watched in fascination and growing unease as Morrison built a fire and heated his branding irons to glowing red perfection, explaining that he wanted to mark each family member with his initials so that everyone in the county would know who had tamed the mountain freaks. Hammond and Cross exchanged worried glances because even their twisted sense of entertainment had limits, but neither man was brave enough to challenge Morrison when he was in one of his violent moods. When Morrison dragged Jeremiah Ketter from the cabin and pressed the searing iron against his shoulder, the screams that echoed through the mountain hollow were unlike anything the men had ever heard before. It wasn't just pain that poured from Jeremiah's throat, but something deeper and more primal, a sound that seemed to carry 30 years of accumulated suffering and rage in a single, endless wail that made the other men step back in genuine fear. But Morrison was too drunk on power and whiskey to recognize the warning signs that his companions were beginning to notice. He didn't see how Ruth Ketter had stopped crying and was now watching him with an expression of cold calculation that seemed completely at odds with her usual terrified demeanor. He didn't notice that old Ezekiel had disappeared from the doorway where he had been cowering, or that Sarah Ketter was no longer making her usual animal-like sounds of distress, but had fallen into an ominous silence that somehow felt more threatening than her previous panic. When Morrison finished branding Jeremiah and announced his intention to mark the rest of the family, Hammond finally found his voice and suggested they had had enough fun for one day. Cross agreed, pointing out that they had been drinking since noon and the mountain trail was treacherous enough in daylight without adding alcohol and approaching darkness to the equation. But Morrison dismissed their concerns with the arrogance of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions, insisting that he was going to finish the job, no matter what anyone else thought. The other men left without him, their discomfort finally overcoming their loyalty to their ringleader, and Morrison was last seen by his departing companions as he forced Ruth Ketter toward his makeshift branding station while she pleaded for mercy in the broken dialect that he found so amusing. Hammond would later tell investigators that Morrison had been laughing and singing drinking songs as their wagon disappeared around the first bend in the trail, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just sealed his own fate. When Morrison failed to return home that night, his wife Sarah assumed he had simply passed out drunk somewhere on the mountain and would stagger home the following morning with a hangover and a sheepish apology. When he didn't appear by Sunday evening, she began to worry and sent word to Hammond and Cross, who organized a search party that combed the trail between town and the Ketter farm without finding any trace of the missing blacksmith. The search party eventually reached the Ketter property, where they found Morrison's wagon and horse tied up behind the cabin as if he had planned to stay overnight, but no sign of Morrison himself. When they questioned the family, old Ezekiel claimed that Morrison had left on foot sometime after dark, heading back toward town by a different trail that he had claimed would be faster than the main road. The story seemed plausible enough, especially since Morrison was known for taking dangerous shortcuts when he had been drinking, and the searchers concluded that he had probably fallen into one of the deep ravines that scarred the mountainside and would likely never be found. The disappearance of Jacob Morrison should have been enough to keep the other men away from the Ketter farm permanently. But human nature has a way of overriding survival instincts when pride and curiosity are involved. Instead of recognizing the danger they might be in, the remaining members of their twisted entertainment group convinced themselves that Morrison's vanishing was nothing more than an unfortunate accident, and some even suggested that his fate served him right for being too aggressive in his treatment of their unwilling performers. Thomas Carlyle was the next to test the mountain's appetite for cruel men, though he approached his final visit with more caution than Morrison had shown. On July 28th, Carlyle made the journey alone, telling his wife that he wanted to check on the family's condition after Morrison's rough treatment of them. But his real motivation was a morbid curiosity about what had happened to the blacksmith and a desire to prove to himself that he was brave enough to face whatever had claimed his former companion. Carlyle found the Ketter family seemingly unchanged by their recent ordeal, with Jeremiah bearing fresh bandages over his brand wounds, but otherwise appearing to have recovered from Morrison's assault. The family seemed almost grateful for a visitor who showed them basic human courtesy, with old Ezekiel even inviting Carlyle into their cabin for a meal and conversation that stretched well into the evening hours. When Carlyle's horse was found wandering loose near the base of the mountain trail 3 days later, the search party that went looking for him found only his empty wagon and a few scattered personal belongings that suggested he had been thrown from his vehicle somewhere along the treacherous mountain road. But it was the disappearance of Mayor Franklin Webb on August 3rd that finally forced the people of Bramblewood to confront the possibility that something more sinister than simple accidents was claiming their prominent citizens. Webb had been the most careful and calculating of the Ketter family's tormentors, never allowing his cruelty to escalate beyond psychological torture and always maintaining the pretense that his visits were motivated by scientific curiosity rather than sadistic pleasure. If someone as cautious and intelligent as Webb could vanish without a trace, then perhaps the mountain itself had become hostile to anyone who dared to venture into its depths. The mayor's disappearance sent shockwaves through the town's social hierarchy because Webb had been not just a civic leader, but also the organizer and intellectual justification for the group's expeditions to the Ketter farm. Without his carefully constructed rationalization about studying genetic abnormalities and documenting social deviancy, the remaining men were forced to confront the ugly truth that they had been participating in systematic torture for no reason other than their own entertainment. Samuel Tucker, the banker, became the fourth victim on August 10th, despite having sworn to his wife that he would never again set foot on the mountain trail after Webb's disappearance. Tucker had been drinking heavily since the mayor vanished, tormented by guilt and fear in equal measure, and his final journey to the Ketter farm appeared to have been motivated by a desperate need to convince himself that his former victims were still alive and well. His body was never found, but his distinctive gold pocket watch was discovered weeks later by a traveling preacher, half buried in the dirt near the Ketter property's boundary line. Peter Hammond, who had been Morrison's closest friend and most enthusiastic supporter, lasted until August 18th before his own curiosity and guilt drove him to make the fatal journey up the mountain. Hammond had been telling anyone who would listen that the disappearances were the result of a curse placed on them by the Ketter family, claiming that their years of inbreeding had given them supernatural powers that they were now using for revenge. His theory was dismissed as the ramblings of a man driven mad by fear, but when Hammond himself vanished after visiting the farm to confront the witches, some people began to wonder if his supernatural explanation might have contained a grain of truth. By late August, the pattern had become impossible to ignore, though the remaining members of the original group were too terrified to acknowledge what was happening publicly. William Cross, who ran the lumber mill, had developed a drinking problem that interfered with his business operations, and he had taken to carrying a loaded pistol wherever he went, convinced that something or someone was hunting the men who had tormented the Ketter family. His paranoia reached a breaking point on August 25th when he decided that the only way to end his fear was to return to the farm with enough firepower to defend himself against whatever had claimed his friends. Cross armed himself with 2 pistols, a rifle, and enough ammunition to fight a small war, but his military preparations proved as useless as the caution that had failed to protect the other victims. His weapons were found scattered around his abandoned wagon, unfired and apparently dropped in haste, as if he had encountered something that rendered his firearms completely irrelevant to his survival. The discovery of Cross's abandoned arsenal marked the point where even the most skeptical residents of Bramblewood were forced to admit that their missing citizens had not simply fallen victim to accidents or coincidences, but had encountered something deliberate and deadly that was picking them off one by one with methodical precision. Deputy Sheriff Coleman Price had been avoiding the obvious for weeks, but when the 6th prominent citizen of Bramblewood vanished after visiting the Ketter farm, he could no longer pretend that coincidence was responsible for the mounting body count. Price had been reluctant to investigate earlier because the missing men were not particularly well-liked in the community, and their families had been surprisingly calm about the disappearances, but public pressure and his own growing unease finally forced him to take official action that would reveal horrors beyond his worst nightmares. On September 2nd, Price made his first official visit to the Ketter property, accompanied by his deputy, Mark Stevens, and armed with a warrant to search the premises for evidence related to the missing persons cases. The deputy had expected to find a family of terrified degenerates who would collapse under questioning. But what he discovered instead was a group of people who seemed remarkably calm and composed for individuals who had supposedly been the victims of years of systematic abuse and harassment. Old Ezekiel Ketter greeted the lawmen with a courtesy that seemed almost mockingly formal, inviting them into the cabin for coffee and conversation while expressing deep concern about the terrible accidents that had been claiming so many of Bramblewood's finest citizens. His speech, which had always been described as barely coherent gibberish by previous visitors, was suddenly clear and articulate, leading Price to wonder if the family's apparent mental disabilities had been greatly exaggerated by their tormentors. Sarah Ketter, who had been described as communicating only through grunts and animal sounds, was able to answer Price's questions in perfectly understandable English, though she claimed to know nothing about the fate of the missing men beyond the fact that they had all left the property alive and apparently in good health. Her transformation from mindless creature to coherent witness was so dramatic that Price began to suspect that much of what the townspeople had reported about the family's mental state had been either wishful thinking or deliberate deception. It was Jeremiah Ketter who provided the most disturbing insights during the interview, displaying an intelligence and awareness that seemed completely at odds with his reputation as a barely functional genetic disaster. When Price questioned him about the brand mark on his shoulder, Jeremiah spoke eloquently about forgiveness and the importance of turning the other cheek when faced with cruelty. But there was something in his eyes that suggested his Christian virtues were more performance than genuine belief. The search of the property revealed evidence that made Price's blood run cold, though none of it was conclusive enough to justify immediate arrests. Personal belongings that matched items known to have been carried by the missing men were scattered around the farm in locations where they could have been lost accidentally, but the quantity and variety suggested something more deliberate than simple carelessness. Morrison's distinctive leather gloves were found in the family's chicken coop. Webb's silver flask was discovered near their vegetable garden, and Hammond's pocket knife was embedded in a fence post as if it had been thrown there in anger or fear. More disturbing than the personal effects was the evidence of recent modifications to the property that served no apparent agricultural purpose but would have been perfect for containing unwilling visitors. The family's root cellar had been expanded significantly, with new walls and chambers that extended far deeper into the mountainside than would have been necessary for food storage. Strange scratches on the walls suggested that people had been kept there against their will, and the smell that emanated from the deepest chambers was unlike anything Price had ever encountered in his years of law enforcement. When Price questioned the family about the cellar modifications, old Ezekiel claimed they had been expanding their storage capacity to prepare for harsh winters, but his explanation didn't account for the heavy wooden beams that had been installed as if to restrain large animals, or the metal rings that had been driven into the stone walls at precisely the height where a man's wrists would be if he were chained standing upright. The family's nervousness when discussing the cellar was the first genuine emotion Price had seen from them during the entire interview, suggesting that whatever secrets lay beneath their farmhouse were significant enough to break through their carefully maintained facade of innocence. As Price prepared to leave the property, he noticed that the family's behavior had shifted subtly but unmistakably from cooperative to predatory, with all four members positioning themselves between him and his horse in a way that seemed casual but felt deliberately threatening. For the first time since arriving at the farm, Price found himself genuinely afraid, not of what the Ketters might have done to his missing citizens, but of what they might be planning to do to him if he pushed his investigation too far. 3 days after his initial visit, Deputy Price returned to the Ketter farm with a larger search party and a determination to uncover the truth that had been gnawing at his conscience since he first smelled the stench rising from that expanded root cellar. What he discovered beneath the seemingly innocent farmhouse would haunt him for the rest of his life, and reveal that the Keter family's apparent victims had actually been the architects of a revenge scheme so methodical and horrifying that it redefined everything the people of Bramblewood thought they knew about human nature. The cellar entrance that had seemed unremarkable during his first visit revealed itself to be an elaborate deception when Price's men pried up the wooden planks and discovered a network of chambers that extended nearly 50 feet into the mountainside. The first room appeared to be a legitimate root cellar, filled with preserved vegetables and cured meats that would have supported the family through multiple harsh winters. But hidden doorways led to additional chambers that served purposes far removed from food storage. The second chamber contained what could only be described as a primitive but effective prison, with stone walls that had been carved into alcoves just large enough to hold a human being in a standing position, but too small to allow sitting or lying down. Heavy iron rings had been driven into the walls at shoulder height, and lengths of chain attached to the rings showed clear evidence of having restrained multiple prisoners over an extended period. The floor was stained with substances that Price didn't want to identify, and the scratches gouged into the stone walls told a story of desperate attempts at escape that had obviously failed. But it was the third chamber that contained the evidence that would prove the Keter family's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Though the proof came in a form so horrifying that Price initially refused to believe what his own eyes were showing him. The room had been converted into a workshop where human bodies were methodically disassembled and processed like livestock, with cutting tools arranged on wooden tables and drainage channels carved into the floor to handle the blood and other fluids that resulted from the family's butchery. Hanging from hooks driven into the ceiling were cuts of meat that had obviously never come from any farm animal, preserved with salt and smoke in the same way that rural families traditionally prepared pork and beef for winter consumption. When Price's stomach finally stopped rebelling long enough for him to examine the evidence more closely, he found personal effects embedded in the hanging flesh that identified the source of the Keter family's private meat supply beyond any possibility of denial. Morrison's distinctive blacksmith ring was still attached to what had once been his finger. Webb's gold dental fillings gleamed from a jaw that had been stripped of everything else that might have identified its former owner. Hammond's pocket watch chain was wrapped around a section of ribs that had been expertly butchered and cured according to techniques that spoke of generations of practice in preparing human flesh for consumption. The discovery that shattered Price's remaining faith in human decency came when he realized that the Keter family had not simply been killing their tormentors in fits of rage or desperate self-defense, but had been systematically farming them like livestock to supplement their food supply during the harsh mountain winters. The evidence suggested that victims had been kept alive in the standing cells for extended periods, probably to keep the meat fresh until it was needed, and that the family had developed their own techniques for determining which parts of the human body provided the best nutrition and flavor. Even more disturbing was the realization that the family's apparent mental disabilities had been an elaborate performance designed to make their victims underestimate them until it was far too late to escape. The precision and planning evident in their killing chambers proved that whatever genetic damage they had suffered had not affected their ability to think strategically or execute complex plans over extended periods. They had spent years allowing themselves to be tortured and humiliated while secretly preparing the infrastructure they would need to turn the tables on their oppressors. The final chamber contained the evidence that explained how the family had managed to lure their victims into the cellar without raising suspicions or triggering struggles that might have been heard by other visitors. A collection of improvised but effective drugs, extracted from local plants and refined through trial and error, had been used to incapacitate the men before they realized they were in danger. The Ketters had been slipping these substances into food and drink offered to their guests, transforming their traditional mountain hospitality into a deadly trap that their victims never saw coming. When Price emerged from the cellar after documenting the evidence, He found the Keter family waiting for him with expressions that had shifted from their previous facade of innocent cooperation to something that resembled pride in their accomplishments. They had been discovered, but they showed no signs of shame or regret for what they had done, and old Ezekiel actually smiled as he asked Price if he had found everything he was looking for in their winter storage. Deputy Price's hands were shaking as he reached for his handcuffs. But before he could speak the words that would place the Keter family under arrest, old Ezekiel raised one gnarled finger and spoke in a voice that carried 30 years of accumulated hatred and carefully planned revenge. You know, Deputy, we've been expecting this moment for quite some time, and we've prepared something special just for you and your men. The casual tone of his words was somehow more terrifying than any shouted threat could have been, and Price suddenly realized that discovering the family's crimes had been exactly what they wanted him to do. Jeremiah stepped forward from where he had been lurking in the cabin doorway, and for the first time, Price got a clear look at the man's face without the mask of simpleton innocence that had fooled an entire community for decades. The intelligence that burned in Jeremiah's eyes was sharp and calculating, completely at odds with his reputation as a damaged victim of genetic catastrophe. And when he smiled, Price saw that his teeth had been filed to points like some primitive predator preparing for a hunt. All those years, Jeremiah said, his voice carrying none of the hesitant mumbling that had characterized his previous interactions with townspeople. All those years of letting you people treat us like animals in a zoo, letting you poke and prod and torture us for your entertainment. Did you really think we were too stupid to remember every single thing you did to us? Did you honestly believe we were going to just keep taking your abuse forever without finding a way to make you pay for it? Price's deputy, Mark Stevens, had been standing near the cellar entrance when the family's demeanor shifted, and he suddenly found himself cut off from his partner by Sarah Ketter, who had moved with surprising speed and agility for someone who had spent years pretending to be barely capable of coordinated movement. In her hands was a crude but effective-looking club that appeared to have been carved from human bone, and the way she held it suggested she had plenty of experience using it as a weapon. The thing about being underestimated, Sarah said, speaking in clear, articulate English that contradicted every report Price had ever heard about her mental capacity, is that people never see you coming until it's far too late to do anything about it. Your friends certainly didn't see us coming, even when we were standing right in front of them offering them food and drink and all the hospitality that good Christian mountain folk are supposed to provide to their guests. Ruth Ketter emerged from behind the cabin carrying what appeared to be a hunting rifle, though closer inspection revealed that it had been modified in ways that Price's law enforcement training couldn't immediately identify. The weapon looked like it had been designed to fire something other than conventional bullets, and the stains on the barrel suggested it had been used recently for purposes that probably weren't related to hunting deer or other game animals. You see, Deputy, old Ezekiel continued, his voice taking on the tone of a schoolteacher explaining a particularly complex lesson to a slow student. We learned a long time ago that the only way people like us can survive in a world full of people like you is to make sure that anyone who hurts us never gets the chance to hurt anyone else ever again. It's really just a matter of basic self-defense, though I suppose most folks wouldn't see it that way. Price realized that his search party had walked directly into a trap that had been designed specifically for law enforcement officers who might eventually come looking for the missing townspeople. The Ketter family had been planning this confrontation from the moment they decided to start taking their revenge, and they had used the time between his first visit and his return to prepare countermeasures that would ensure no one would ever leave their property alive to report what they had discovered. The deputy's hand moved toward his pistol, but Jeremiah shook his head with the patience of someone who had anticipated every possible response to their revelation. I wouldn't recommend trying that, Deputy. You see, we've had plenty of time to study how your people react when they're scared, and we've learned that most of you aren't nearly as brave as you pretend to be when you're not tormenting helpless victims. Stevens made a desperate lunge toward the tree line, hoping to escape and bring help from town, but Sarah's bone club caught him in the back of the head with a sickening crack that dropped him to the ground like a sack of grain. The casual efficiency with which she delivered the blow suggested that she had plenty of practice incapacitating fleeing victims, and Price suddenly understood that his entire search party had been doomed from the moment they set foot on the Ketter property. "Now then," Ezekiel said, his smile widening to reveal teeth that had been sharpened to match his son's predatory dental work. "Let's discuss how we're going to handle this situation in a way that benefits everyone involved." As Deputy Price found himself trapped between the Ketter family and their bone-littered cellar, the full scope of their crimes began to unfold in a confession that revealed decades of methodical planning and a level of depravity that challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of human evil. What he had initially assumed was a recent outbreak of violence triggered by years of abuse was actually the culmination of a multi-generational revenge scheme that had been carefully orchestrated to ensure that no one who participated in tormenting the family would survive to continue their cruelty. Old Ezekiel, now fully abandoning his persona as a harmless mountain simpleton, explained that the family's apparent genetic disabilities had been greatly exaggerated and deliberately performed to make their enemies underestimate them while they gathered intelligence and planned their counterattack. "You people see what you expect to see," he said with the pride of a master strategist revealing his most brilliant deception. "Show them a few twisted limbs and some drooling, and they'll convince themselves that you're too stupid to remember who hurt you or too weak to do anything about it." The truth was that while generations of inbreeding had indeed caused physical deformities and some cognitive impairment, the family had retained enough intelligence to understand exactly what was being done to them and to develop increasingly sophisticated plans for making their tormentors pay for their cruelty. They had spent years studying the behavior patterns of their visitors, learning which men were most likely to come alone, which ones carried weapons, and which ones had families who would quickly notice their absence. Jeremiah revealed that the family had been using their victims for far more than just supplementing their food supply during harsh winters, though that practical benefit had certainly been appreciated. They had discovered that human flesh, when properly prepared and seasoned with herbs that grew wild in the mountain forests, provided superior nutrition compared to the scrawny livestock they could afford to raise on their isolated farm. More importantly, consuming their enemies had given them a sense of power and completion that went far beyond simple revenge. "When you eat someone," Jeremiah explained with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, "you take everything they were and make it part of yourself. Their strength becomes your strength, their knowledge becomes your knowledge, and their fear becomes your satisfaction. We've been growing stronger with every one of those bastards we've consumed, and now we're more than capable of handling anyone who tries to stop us." Sarah Ketter provided the most disturbing details about their methods, describing how they had perfected techniques for keeping their victims alive and conscious during the initial stages of butchering to ensure maximum fear and suffering before death finally provided relief. They had learned that terror improved the flavor of human flesh in the same way that stress hormones affected the taste of conventional livestock, and they had developed elaborate rituals designed to maximize their victims' psychological torment before the physical dismemberment began. The family had also been using parts of their victims that weren't suitable for consumption to improve their property and expand their killing capabilities. Human bones had been carved into tools and weapons that were more effective than anything they could have purchased or traded for in town. Skin had been treated and cured to create leather goods that were both functional and symbolic of their triumph over their oppressors. Even the blood had been used to fertilize their vegetable garden, creating a grotesque cycle where the town's food supply had been indirectly contaminated by their own missing citizens. Ruth Ketter, who had been the primary target of the townspeople's sexual humiliation, revealed that she had been keeping detailed records of every act of violence and degradation committed against the family, along with careful notes about which specific punishments each perpetrator deserved based on the severity and frequency of their crimes. Her memory for faces, names, and individual acts of cruelty was photographic in its precision, and she had been planning personalized torture scenarios for each of their enemies that would reflect the exact nature of the suffering they had inflicted. The most chilling revelation came when Price realized that the Ketter family's reign of terror was far from over, and that they had been using the disappearances of the prominent townsmen as a way to identify and eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to their continued existence. They had compiled lists of everyone who had ever visited their property, everyone who had participated in their torment, and everyone who might eventually come looking for the missing men. Price and his search party were simply the next names to be crossed off their carefully maintained roster of future victims. "The beautiful thing about our situation," old Ezekiel said as he gestured toward the cellar entrance where so many of Bramblewood's citizens had met their fate, "is that we're not planning to stop until every single person who ever hurt us has paid the price for their cruelty. And since you people have been so helpful in teaching us exactly how much pain the human body can endure before it finally gives up, we're going to make sure that each of you gets to experience every lesson you taught us, but from the receiving end this time." The fate of Deputy Price and his search party was sealed the moment they discovered the truth about the Ketter family's crimes. But their deaths would not go unnoticed the way the previous disappearances had been dismissed as accidents or coincidences. When the deputy and his men failed to return from the mountain, the remaining citizens of Bramblewood finally understood that they were dealing with something far beyond the capabilities of conventional law enforcement, and they took justice into their own hands with a fury that matched the cruelty they had once inflicted for entertainment. The mob that assembled on September 8, 1879, consisted of nearly every able-bodied man in Bramblewood, armed with rifles, shotguns, and enough determination to ensure that the Ketter family's reign of terror would end permanently. They had spent 3 days planning their assault on the mountain farm, studying the terrain and developing strategies that would prevent any of the family members from escaping to continue their killing spree in some other isolated location where new victims might fall prey to their twisted appetites. What the townspeople found when they reached the Ketter property was a family that had been expecting them and had prepared for this final confrontation with the same methodical planning that had characterized all their previous crimes. The cabin had been fortified with barriers constructed from the bones of their victims, creating a grotesque fortress that served as both defensive position and a final taunt to the people who had created the monsters they now faced. The battle that followed was brief but savage, with the Ketter family fighting with the desperate ferocity of cornered animals who had nothing left to lose. They had rigged their property with traps and ambush positions that claimed several more lives before the superior numbers and firepower of the townspeople finally overwhelmed their defenses. When the shooting finally stopped, all 4 members of the Ketter family lay dead among the scattered remains of their victims, bringing an end to a cycle of violence that had consumed nearly 20 lives over the course of 4 years. The townspeople's victory was complete but Pyrrhic, as they realized that revealing the truth about what had happened on the mountain would destroy Bramblewood's reputation and bring unwanted attention from state and federal authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about how the situation had been allowed to escalate to such horrific extremes. The decision was made to burn the Ketter property to the ground and to create a cover story that would protect the community from the consequences of their own complicity in creating the tragedy. Official records from 1879 show that Jacob Morrison died in a mining accident. Thomas Carlyle was killed when his wagon overturned on a mountain trail. Mayor Franklin Webb suffered a heart attack while hunting, and the other missing men met similar mundane fates that had nothing to do with cannibalistic revenge or systematic torture. Deputy Price and his search party were reported as victims of a flash flood that swept them away while they were investigating reports of illegal moonshine operations in the remote mountain regions. The Ketter family's farm was listed in county records as having been destroyed by a lightning strike that caused a fire too remote to be extinguished by volunteer firefighters, and the property was abandoned and allowed to return to wilderness. Within a decade, most traces of the buildings had been erased by weather and vegetation, leaving only a few foundation stones and some unusually fertile soil that local hunters occasionally noticed but never investigated too closely. The people of Bramblewood carried the secret of what really happened on the mountain for the rest of their lives, passing down warnings to their children and grandchildren about the dangers of tormenting those who seemed helpless and defenseless. The story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of cruelty, though the specific details were gradually lost as the original witnesses died and the memory of the events faded into local folklore. But the legacy of the Ketter family's revenge extended far beyond the boundaries of their small mountain community, because their story represented something darker and more universal about human nature than anyone wanted to acknowledge. They had proven that even the most damaged and apparently helpless people could find ways to strike back against their oppressors, and that the line between victim and monster was often thinner than civilized society wanted to admit. The mountain hollow where the Ketter family lived and died remains empty to this day, avoided by hunters and hikers who report strange sensations and unpleasant odors that seem to linger despite the passage of nearly 150 years. Local legends claim that the spirits of both the victims and their killers still roam the area, locked in an eternal cycle of revenge and retribution that serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when human cruelty is allowed to flourish unchecked in the shadows of isolated places where no one is watching and no one cares enough to intervene. If you enjoyed this dark journey into the depths of human nature, make sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore the shadows where ordinary people become monsters and justice takes forms that civilized society would never sanction. Tomorrow, we'll be diving into another tale of revenge and retribution that will make you question everything you think you know about good and evil.